She was just the quiet one who worked the morning shift. Roy Bellamy liked to joke about her at the counter. Slowest waitress in town, he told his friends, not bothering to lower his voice. She refilled his coffee without a word. But when the man at table 9 collapsed, gasping, clutching his chest, the quiet one was suddenly the loudest voice in the room. "Move the chairs. Call it in. Now." Her voice cut through the panic like she had done this 1,000 times before, because she had. Her hands moved with a precision no waitress should have. Somewhere behind her eyes, 20 years of a different life were coming back. Welcome to Corner Diner Stories. Subscribe for more stories from the corner table. They didn't know the quiet waitress was a retired surgeon, until a man collapsed at table 9. Nobody ever remembered her name at the corner diner. She was just the quiet one, the woman who worked the morning shift, the one who never talked much, never laughed loud, never asked for anything. She poured the coffee. She wiped the counters. She kept her eyes down. A regular named Roy Bellamy liked to joke about her at the counter. Slowest waitress in town, he told his friends, not bothering to lower his voice. She refilled his coffee without a word. But when the man at table 9 collapsed, gasping, clutching his chest, the quiet one was suddenly the loudest voice in the room. "Move the chairs. Call it in. Now." Her voice cut through the panic like she had done this 1,000 times before, because she had. Her hands moved with a precision no waitress should have. Somewhere behind her eyes, 20 years of a different life were coming back. Welcome to Corner Diner Stories. Subscribe for more stories from the corner table. The corner diner opened at 6 every morning. It smelled like burnt coffee and bacon grease. The floor tiles were cracked near the register. The bell above the door had a chip in it, so it rang a half-second late. She was always the first one there. Her name was Eleanor Voss. Nobody at the diner called her that. Nobody at the diner called her anything at all. She wore her hair pulled back tight. She wore flat shoes with worn soles. She moved through the tables like she was trying not to be seen. Frank Hale owned the place. He'd owned it for 11 years. He hired her 3 years ago on a rainy Tuesday, no questions asked. "You got references?" he'd said. "No," she'd said. "You got a reason you need this job?" She'd looked at him for a long moment. "Yes." He hired her on the spot. He never asked again. Frank liked to say the diner ran on 2 things, coffee and people nobody else wanted to hire. Eleanor fit right in. She worked the 6 a.m. shift every day, 6 days a week. She never called out. She never complained. She never once raised her voice. The other waitress, a 24-year-old named Sophia Reyes, used to try to get her talking. "You ever have a life before this?" Sophia asked once, refilling the ketchup bottles. "Everybody has a life before this," Eleanor said. "That's not an answer." Eleanor smiled, just barely, and went back to wiping down table 6. Sophia gave up asking after that. But she noticed things. She noticed the way Eleanor's hands never shook, not once, not even when she was carrying 4 plates at a time. She noticed the way Eleanor watched the door every time it opened, like she was checking for something. She noticed the small white scar on the back of Eleanor's left hand. A straight line, precise, like it had been made on purpose. She never asked about that one. The diner had its rhythms, and Eleanor had learned every one of them. 6 a.m. brought the truckers and the early shift workers, men and women in reflective vests who ate fast and tipped well and rarely said more than thank you on their way out. 7:30 brought the retirees, the ones with nowhere to be, who nursed their coffee for an hour and talked about grandchildren and knee surgeries and the price of gasoline. 8:15 brought Roy Bellamy. 9 o'clock brought a lull, 20 quiet minutes where Eleanor could stand by the window and watch the street outside, the mail carrier making her rounds, a school bus idling at the corner, the ordinary machinery of a town that had no idea what she used to be. She liked that lull. She had built her whole life around it in a way. 22 years of chaos, alarms, gurneys, blood pressure numbers falling too fast, and then 3 years of 9 o'clock lulls, where nothing was an emergency, where nobody's life depended on the next 60 seconds. She hadn't realized, until Harold Fenwick's fork hit the floor, how much she'd missed the feeling of being needed. Roy Bellamy came in every day at 8:15. He sat at the counter. He ordered the same thing every time. 2 eggs, over easy, wheat toast, black coffee. He'd made his money in used cars. He liked to remind people of that. He liked to remind people of a lot of things. "You know what I paid for this watch?" he said one morning, holding his wrist out to nobody in particular. "More than you make in a month, sweetheart." Eleanor set his coffee down. She didn't spill a drop. "Enjoy your breakfast, Mr. Bellamy," she said. "That's it? No comeback?" He laughed, looking around for an audience. Nobody laughed with him. Some people just don't have it in them. She walked away. She always walked away. Frank saw the whole thing from behind the register. He didn't say anything either. He'd learned a long time ago that Eleanor didn't need defending. She just needed to be left alone. But it bothered him anyway. It bothered him every single time. There was a Tuesday in March when it got worse. Eleanor was moving a little slower that morning. She'd been up most of the night. She didn't say why. She never said why. She dropped a fork, just a fork. It clattered against the tile and skittered under a table. Roy laughed loud enough for the whole counter to hear. "Careful with that tray, sweetheart," he said. "Some of us actually matter." She bent down. She picked up the fork. Her hand did not shake. "I'll get you a clean one," she said. "Damn right you will." Sophia watched her walk to the kitchen. She followed her back there a minute later, found her standing at the sink, both hands flat on the counter, head down. "You okay?" Sophia asked. "I'm fine," Eleanor said. "You don't have to let him talk to you like that." Eleanor turned the water off. She looked at Sophia for a long moment, the way she looked at people when she was deciding how much to say. "I've been talked to worse," she said, "by people whose opinion actually mattered." She grabbed a clean fork and walked back out to the floor. Sophia didn't understand what that meant. Not yet. There was another regular who deserved mentioning, though he came in less often, an older man named Walt Kessler, a retired mailman who'd known Frank Hale since they were both young enough to still believe the diner would make them rich. Walt liked to sit near the register and talk to Frank about the old days. "That new girl," Walt said once, nodding toward Eleanor. "Something about her." "She's not new," Frank said. "She's been here 3 years." "That's not what I mean." Walt watched her carry a tray of plates to a booth near the window, balanced perfectly, not a single glass rattling. "She moves like she used to be somebody." Frank didn't answer that. He'd wondered the same thing more than once, but he'd also learned, over 11 years of running this diner, that the people who ended up behind his counter usually had reasons they didn't want spoken out loud. He respected that. He never pushed. He just kept hiring the ones nobody else wanted. And he kept discovering again and again that nobody else wanted them, and they had nothing to offer, were two very different sentences. At night, Eleanor went home to a small apartment 2 miles from the diner. 1 bedroom. A kitchen table with 2 chairs, though she only ever used one. On the wall above the kitchen table, there was a photograph. A young man, maybe 22, grinning at the camera, wearing a Reagan National Airport t-shirt and holding up a diploma. Daniel Voss, her son. She looked at that photograph every night before bed. She never looked away from it fast. She made herself look at it until it hurt exactly the right amount, and then a little longer than that. Then she turned off the light. 12 years ago, Eleanor Voss had been Dr. Eleanor Voss, chief of trauma surgery at Ashford Memorial Hospital. 22 years in the operating room, thousands of surgeries, a reputation that traveled across 3 states. Surgeons called her when they had a case nobody else could save. Steady hands. That's what they used to say about her. The steadiest hands in the building. She built that reputation one impossible case at a time. Gunshot wounds, car wrecks, a collapsed lung on a table at 2 in the morning with nothing but a resident and a nurse who'd never seen that much blood. There was a night, 9 years before Daniel, when a 19-year-old came through the trauma bay after a motorcycle accident. His heart stopped twice on her table, and everyone in the room had quietly started preparing for the worst. Eleanor didn't stop. She worked through the second cardiac arrest like it was the first, like she had all the time in the world, though the monitors said otherwise. He walked out of that hospital 6 weeks later. He sent her a wedding invitation 4 years after that. She still had it somewhere, packed away in a box she hadn't opened since the move. That was the job. That was 22 years of her life. 1,000 rooms just like that one. 1,000 moments where the only thing standing between a person and the end of their story was whether her hands held steady. They always held steady. Colleagues used to joke that nothing could rattle her. Residents were sent to observe her surgeries specifically to learn what calm under pressure looked like in practice, not in a textbook. She never lost her composure. Not once. Not in 22 years. Then, on a Thursday in October, the trauma bay doors opened, and the gurney that came through had her son on it. Daniel had been driving home from his cousin's wedding. A truck ran a red light on Route 9. She was on shift. She was the surgeon on call. There was no one else in the building who could do what needed to be done, and there was no time to call someone else in. She scrubbed in. Her hands did not shake. They never shook. She operated on her own son for 3 hours and 11 minutes. The monitor above the table had told her everything before her hands did. She remembered the sound of it more than the sight, a rhythm that faltered again, then refused to hold. She remembered her own voice, distant and clinical, calling for more units of blood, more time, more of anything that might change what the monitor was telling her. She remembered the exact moment she understood there was nothing left to try. Silence? He did not survive the surgery. Nobody in that hospital ever said a word against her. Everyone in that building knew she had done everything a surgeon could do. The damage had been too severe before he ever reached her table. It didn't matter what anyone said. She knew what she knew. She had held a scalpel over her own child, and she had not been enough. In the weeks that followed, she went back to work twice. Both times, she stood outside the operating room doors and could not make herself walk through them. Her hands, the steadiest hands in the building, shook so badly the second time that a nurse had to catch the clipboard before it fell. The hospital offered her leave. They offered her a counselor. They offered her a slower rotation, fewer trauma cases, more time to heal. She thanked them for all of it and told them none of it would help. She wasn't afraid of the operating room. She was afraid of what it meant to walk in there and be trusted with someone else's child when she hadn't been able to save her own. She resigned 4 months later. She didn't fight the hospital's attempt to talk her out of it. She didn't take another job in medicine. Colleagues she'd worked beside for 15 years sent cards, casseroles, offers to talk whenever she was ready. A few of them tried calling for months afterward, long after most people give up. She let the calls go to voicemail. She never listened to the messages. She told herself she would, someday, and someday never came. She sold the house. She moved 3 states away to a town where nobody knew her name, and she found the smallest, quietest job she could find. A diner needed a waitress. She could pour coffee. She could carry plates. Nobody would ask her to save anyone ever again. That was the whole plan. For 3 years, it worked. The Tuesday it stopped working started like any other. The diner was 3/4 full. Sophia was working the back tables. Frank was at the register, going through the morning receipts. Roy Bellamy was in his usual seat at the counter, halfway through his eggs, already complaining about something on the television bolted to the wall. The radio behind the counter was playing something quiet. Frank had the receipts spread out in front of him, muttering about the price of eggs. Sophia was refilling ketchup bottles at the far end of the counter, humming along to the radio without realizing it. It was, in every way that mattered, an unremarkable morning. At table 9, near the window, a man sat alone with a cup of coffee and a plate of pancakes he hadn't touched. His name was Harold Fenwick, 68 years old. He came in every few weeks, always alone, always quiet. He was a retired long-haul trucker, driving through on his way to visit a daughter he hadn't seen in 2 years. He was in the middle of a sentence to no one in particular, some comment about the weather, when he stopped talking. He didn't finish the sentence. His fork slipped out of his hand. Then he slumped forward, face first onto the plate of pancakes. For 1 full second, nobody moved. Nobody understood what they were looking at. Then a woman 2 tables over screamed. Chairs scraped. Someone dropped a mug, and it shattered on the tile. Sophia froze mid-step, a coffee pot still in her hand. Roy Bellamy spun around on his stool, eggs forgotten, face going pale. Everyone froze. Eleanor did not freeze. She was already moving before the mug finished shattering. She crossed the diner floor in 4 long strides, faster than anyone had ever seen her move, faster than anyone knew she could move. Move the chairs. Call it in. Now. Her voice cut through the noise like a blade. It was not the voice of the quiet waitress. It was not a request. Sophia grabbed her phone with shaking hands and dialed 911. Eleanor eased Harold back off the plate and onto the floor, one arm cradling his head so it didn't strike the tile. She tilted his chin. She checked his airway. She pressed 2 fingers to his neck. Silence. No pulse. 2 words. Flat, fast, certain. Not a guess. A diagnosis. She began compressions immediately, her hands stacked, elbows locked, counting under her breath in a rhythm that never wavered. 1, 2, 3, 4. Frank came around the counter, phone in hand, relaying the dispatcher's questions. They're asking how long he's been down. Under a minute, Eleanor said, not breaking rhythm. Tell them we need an AED if there's one in the building. Tell them cardiac arrest, unresponsive, no pulse, CPR in progress. Frank repeated it, word for word. He didn't know he was quoting a trauma surgeon. He just knew to do exactly what she said. Roy Bellamy stood frozen by the counter, his mouth open, no sound coming out. Nobody moves, nobody panics, nobody looks away. Eleanor kept counting. Sweat beaded on her forehead. Her arms burned. She did not slow down. Sophia, behind the register, bottom shelf, there's a first aid kit. Bring it, now. Sophia ran. 30, Eleanor said, and tilted Harold's head back, sealed her mouth over his, and gave 2 slow breaths. His chest rose. She went back to compressions. 1, 2, 3, 4. A minute passed. It felt like an hour. Nobody in the diner spoke. The only sound was Eleanor's counting and the hiss of the coffee machine nobody had thought to turn off. Somewhere in the back of her mind, a memory surfaced. Not Daniel, not the trauma bay, but a different patient, years ago. A man in his 60s who'd coded on her table and come back because she refused to stop. She held onto that memory. She used it like a rope. Come on, she said quietly, to Harold, to herself, to nobody. Come on. Sophia came running back with the first aid kit, dropping to her knees beside Eleanor, hands trembling, waiting for instructions. There's no defibrillator, Sophia said, voice shaking. I checked. There's nothing. Then we don't stop, Eleanor said, not breaking rhythm. We don't need one yet. We need oxygen moving and blood circulating. That's all this is. Keep the door clear for the paramedics. Frank relayed another question from the dispatcher. They're asking if he has any known heart conditions. Ask the daughter, Eleanor said. I don't know him. Somebody find out if he's got family listed on him. Wallet, phone, anything. A woman 2 tables over, the one who'd screamed first, found her voice again and started digging through Harold's jacket pocket with shaking hands, pulling out a worn leather wallet, a folded photograph of a young woman tucked behind his driver's license. There's a number, the woman said. Emergency contact. Should I call it? Not yet, Eleanor said. Let's get him breathing first, then we call. 2 minutes in, her shoulders burned with a familiar ache. The same ache she used to feel standing over an operating table for 6 hours straight. She welcomed it. The ache meant she was still working. The ache meant she hadn't given up. 1, 2, 3, 4. At compression 96, Harold's chest jerked. He made a sound, wet and ragged, and then he coughed hard, his eyes fluttering open in confusion and pain. Eleanor rolled him gently onto his side. There you are, she said, her voice suddenly soft. The voice of a woman who had done this exact thing 1,000 times and never once gotten used to the relief of it. You're okay. Stay with me. You're okay. The woman with the wallet, whose name turned out to be Deb Winters, a retired schoolteacher who ate at the diner every Wednesday, made the call to Harold's daughter with a shaking voice, relaying details she barely understood herself, promising over and over that he was in good hands. He was. Everyone in that diner could see it by then. By the 3rd round of compressions, the whole room had organized itself around Eleanor without a single word of instruction beyond what she gave. Frank kept the door clear. Sophia kept the dispatcher updated. Deb held Harold's wallet and his daughter's number ready the instant Eleanor asked for it. Even Roy Bellamy had gone quiet, useful for once, herding 2 frightened children away from the scene toward their mother's booth. Nobody moves without a reason. Nobody speaks without a purpose. Nobody looks away from what needs to be done. The paramedics arrived 4 minutes later. Sirens outside, boots through the door, a stretcher rolling across the tile. The lead paramedic knelt beside Harold, listened to Eleanor's rapid report. Time down, compressions given, breathing restored, vitals as she'd assessed them, and looked up at her with an expression that shifted slowly from professional focus to something else entirely. You a nurse? He asked. Eleanor didn't answer right away. She looked down at her hands, still trembling slightly now that the adrenaline was starting to fade. I used to be a surgeon, she said quietly. The paramedic's partner, a younger man loading equipment onto the stretcher, looked up sharply. Wait, he said. Voss? Dr. Voss? His eyes went wide. Ashford Memorial. I did my EMT rotation there. Everybody talked about you. They called you the steadiest hands in the building. Silence. Every person in that diner turned to look at her. Roy Bellamy's face had gone the color of old paper. The paramedics loaded Harold onto the stretcher. He reached out and caught Eleanor's sleeve with one weak hand. Thank you, he rasped. Get some rest, she said. Someone will come check on you soon. They wheeled him out. The bell above the door rang, a half-second late, the way it always did. For a long moment, nobody in the diner said a word. Then Frank Hale broke the silence. 3 years, he said, staring at her. 3 years you worked here and never said a word. You never asked me to save anyone, Eleanor said. It never came up. Sophia was crying, though she didn't seem to realize it. You knew exactly what to do, every second of it. How did you... 22 years of practice, Eleanor said simply. Roy Bellamy stood up from his stool. He walked toward her slowly, his usual bravado nowhere to be found. He stopped a few feet away, hands in his pockets, looking at the floor like a man twice his age. I said some things to you, he said. Over the years, things I shouldn't have. Eleanor looked at him. She didn't say anything cruel. She didn't need to. You didn't know, she said. That's not really an excuse, is it? No, she agreed. It isn't. He nodded slowly, and for the first time since anyone at the diner had known him, Roy Bellamy looked like a man who understood exactly how small he'd been. What nobody at the diner knew about Roy Bellamy was that he'd buried his wife 4 years earlier, after long illness that had emptied both his savings and, in ways he never spoke about, most of his patience for the world. The bragging, the loud watch, the jokes at other people's expense. It was armor, cheap and obvious to anyone who'd ever worn a version of it themselves. Eleanor recognized it the moment she saw it clearly, weeks after the collapse, watching him linger at the counter long after his coffee had gone cold. You lost someone, she said one morning, not a question. Roy looked up startled. How'd you know that? I used to be good at reading rooms, she said. It's part of the job, was part of the job. He was quiet for a long moment, turning his mug slowly in his hands. 4 years this spring, he finally said. Cancer. Took 18 months to do it, which I used to think was the cruelest kind, giving you time to watch and not enough time to fix anything. There's no kind version, Eleanor said. I'm sorry. You didn't ask for my life story. No, she agreed. But I've got some room for it if you want to give it. He didn't. Not that day. But he came back the next morning and the one after that, and slowly, over the weeks that followed, the loud jokes at the counter grew quieter, replaced, more often than not, by something closer to conversation. A reporter from the local paper showed up 2 days later, notebook in hand, asking if Eleanor would sit for an interview. Local waitress. Revealed as retired surgeon, saves man's life. That was the headline they wanted to run, more or less. Eleanor said no. People will want to know your story, the reporter pressed. It's inspiring. My story isn't for a headline, Eleanor said, polite but immovable. Write about Harold instead. Write about the paramedics who got him the rest of the way. That's the story that matters. The reporter left disappointed, but the paper ran a smaller piece anyway, 3 paragraphs on page 6, mostly about Harold's recovery and his daughter's gratitude. Eleanor's name appeared exactly once, in the 4th line, no photograph attached. That was exactly how she wanted it. Harold Fenwick spent 4 days in the hospital. His daughter drove 6 hours to sit beside his bed. When he was discharged, the first place he asked to go was the corner diner. He walked in on a Thursday morning, moving slowly, a little pale, but upright and breathing on his own. And the whole diner went quiet when they saw him. He walked straight to the counter, to Eleanor, and he didn't say anything at first. He just reached out and took both of her hands in his. You gave me 6 more years with my daughter, he said. His voice broke on the last word. Maybe more. However many I get now, they're because of you. Eleanor's throat tightened. She had heard thank yous before, in another life, in another building, from other families on the worst day of their lives. She had never quite let herself feel them the way she felt this one. I'm glad I was here, she said, and for the first time in 3 years, she meant those words with her whole chest. Harold's daughter, a woman named Renee, lingered near the register after her father sat down at his old table. We'd like to have you over, she said. For dinner. It doesn't have to be anything fancy. We'd like the chance to thank you properly, not in a diner with a rag in your hand. Eleanor hesitated. She hadn't sat at another family's dinner table in longer than she could easily remember. It had always felt like trespassing on something that wasn't hers anymore. I'd like that, she said, surprising herself. She went 3 weeks later on her one night off. Renee's house was small and warm, cluttered with the particular chaos of a family that had almost lost someone and hadn't stopped being grateful about it since. Harold's grandchildren, 2 of them, under the age of 10, treated Eleanor like a celebrity, peppering her with questions about hospitals and ambulances until their mother gently redirected them. At the end of the night, standing at the door, Harold took her hand again, the same way he had that first morning back at the diner. I don't know what I did to earn a second chance like this, he said, but I intend to spend the rest of it right. You don't have to earn it, Eleanor said. None of us do. That's sort of the whole point. She drove home that night with the radio off, windows cracked, letting the cool air move through the car. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel like a woman hiding from her own life. She felt instead like a woman slowly finding her way back into it. A few weeks after that, an older man walked into the diner during the Tuesday morning rush, silver-haired, wearing a hospital lanyard from 3 counties over. He stopped mid-step when he saw her behind the counter, coffee pot in hand. Eleanor Voss, he said, disbelief written across his face. I heard a rumor. I didn't believe it until right now. She recognized him after a moment. Dr. Aaron Petrov, a cardiologist she'd worked alongside for nearly a decade at Ashford Memorial. He'd been one of the ones who kept calling all those months ago, long after everyone else had stopped. Aaron, she said quietly. I never stopped wondering where you went, he said. None of us did. She poured him a cup of coffee, her hands steady, and for the first time since she'd left medicine, she let herself sit down across from someone from her old life and actually talk. They stayed there for over an hour after her shift ended, Frank quietly waving off anyone who tried to take the booth. Aaron didn't ask her to come back to Ashford Memorial. He didn't push. He just listened the way an old friend listens, and before he left, he asked if he could visit again sometime. I'd like that, Eleanor said for the second time in a month, and meant it just as much as the first. That night, Eleanor did something she hadn't done in 3 years. She went home, and instead of looking away from Daniel's photograph, she pulled a chair up close to the wall and sat down in front of it. I did it again today, she said quietly, to the photograph, to the empty apartment, to whatever was left of him that still listened. I brought someone back. She had spent 3 years believing that the last surgery of her career had been a failure so complete, it erased everything that came before it. 22 years of saved lives, undone in her own mind by one operating table she couldn't win. Sitting there, she understood, slowly, painfully, that it didn't work that way. It had never worked that way. She had not failed as a surgeon. She had lost her son. Those were 2 different truths, and she had spent 3 years treating them as one. I'm sorry I stopped, she whispered. I think you'd have wanted me to keep going. She sat there a long time. When she finally stood up, Something in her chest felt lighter than it had in years. Not healed, not fixed, just lighter. 3 weeks after Harold Fenwick's collapse on the anniversary of Daniel's death, Eleanor didn't come in for her shift. She had never missed a day in 3 years. Frank called twice. She didn't answer. Sophia found her that evening, sitting on a bench outside the community cemetery 2 towns over, coat pulled tight against the wind, a small bouquet of white carnations resting beside her on the bench. Sophia had gotten the address from Frank, who'd quietly kept it on file since the day he hired her, in case something ever happened and someone needed to know where to send flowers. "I didn't want to intrude," Sophia said, standing a few feet away. "I just wanted to make sure you weren't alone." Eleanor didn't look up right away. 12 years today," she said. Sophia sat down beside her without being invited. She didn't say anything for a long while. She just sat there in the cold, keeping her company. "I used to think," Eleanor finally said, "that saving Harold Fenwick meant I'd made peace with it. I went home that night and I told myself I'd finally forgiven my own hands." She shook her head slowly. "It doesn't work like that. Some days it's easier. Today isn't one of them." "You don't have to be at peace with it," Sophia said. "You just have to keep showing up. That's what you do every single day. That's more than most people manage." Eleanor looked at her for a long moment, surprised, the way she always was, by how much this young woman understood without being told. "When did you get so wise?" Eleanor asked. "I had a good teacher," Sophia said. "She pours a mean cup of coffee." Eleanor laughed. It was a small laugh, rusty from disuse, but it was real, and it startled her almost as much as it seemed to startle Sophia. They sat there until the sun went down, 2 women on a cemetery bench, saying nothing else that needed saying. On the drive back, Sophia finally admitted something she'd never told anyone at the diner. "I applied to nursing school last spring," she said, eyes on the road. "I got in. I deferred it. I told myself I needed the money first, needed more time, needed 100 reasons that weren't the real one." "What's the real one?" Eleanor asked. "I was scared I'd get in over my head. Scared I'd freeze the first time it actually mattered." Sophia glanced at her. "Then I watched you not freeze, not for 1 second. I want to know how you do that." "You don't do it by not being scared," Eleanor said. "I was terrified, kneeling over Harold. I just didn't let the fear make any of the decisions. Fear can ride along. It doesn't get to steer." Sophia was quiet for a while, turning that over. "I think I'm going to undefer," she finally said. "Good," Eleanor said. "The world needs more people who show up scared and do the work anyway. That's most of what being steady actually is. Nobody tells you that part." Sophia enrolled the following semester. She kept working mornings at the diner around her class schedule, and every Tuesday night, without fail, she sat in the front row of Eleanor's CPR course, taking notes like her life depended on it, because, in a way, someday somebody's life would. Word got around town fast. A retired trauma surgeon working the morning shift at the corner diner was not the kind of story that stayed quiet. Eleanor didn't quit her job. She kept showing up at 6 every morning, kept pouring coffee, kept wiping down the same tables she'd wiped down for 3 years. But something had shifted. Frank Hale started leaving a folded newspaper by the register every morning, open to the local health section, like he was hoping she'd notice something in it. Sophia asked her more questions now, and Eleanor answered most of them. Roy Bellamy still came in every morning at 8:15. He still ordered the same breakfast. But he never spoke to her the way he used to. He'd learned the hard way what it looked like to underestimate someone who had spent her whole life quietly holding other people's lives together. 6 months after Harold Fenwick walked out of that hospital, the local community center asked Eleanor if she'd be willing to teach a free CPR course. She said no the first time they asked. She said no the second time, too. She kept turning it over in her mind after each refusal, unable to explain, even to herself, why the idea felt so heavy. Teaching meant standing in front of people and admitting, out loud, that she knew things worth knowing. It meant being seen again, in a way she'd spent 3 years avoiding. The third time, Sophia asked her to do it, not the community center. Sophia asked her at the end of a slow Sunday shift, wiping down the counter beside her. "You saved a man's life in under 2 minutes," Sophia said. "How many people in this town don't know how to do that? How many people could you teach before something like that happens to someone they love?" Eleanor thought about Daniel. She thought about the 3 years she'd spent believing her hands weren't meant to help anyone anymore. "Okay," she said. "I'll teach 1 class." 1 class became 6. 6 became a standing monthly course held in the diner's back room after closing, free to anyone in town who wanted to learn. Frank donated the space without being asked twice. The first class had 11 people in it. Sophia sat in the front row, taking notes like her life depended on it. Walt Kessler came, creaky knees and all, insisting a retired mailman ought to know how to help a neighbor in trouble. Roy Bellamy came too. He sat in the back, arms crossed, saying almost nothing for the first 20 minutes. Eleanor noticed him. She didn't call him out. She just kept teaching, walking the room through compressions on a plastic training mannequin, counting the rhythm out loud the same way she'd counted it over Harold Fenwick's chest. 1, 2, 3, 4. When it came time for the class to practice, Roy hesitated at first, then knelt down beside a mannequin like everyone else, hands stacked, elbows locked, following her count with a focus nobody had ever seen on his face before. "You're pushing too shallow," Eleanor told him, kneeling beside him, adjusting his hand placement. 2 inches, minimum. You won't hurt them. You're far more likely to hurt someone by holding back. "Story of my life," Roy muttered. And for once, it didn't sound like a joke at anyone else's expense. By the end of the class, his form was solid. By the end of the 3rd class, he was helping new students find the rhythm, the way an old, humbled version of himself might have wanted to help all along. They named it, eventually without much ceremony, the Daniel Voss Community Health Program, because Sophia insisted, and because Eleanor, for the first time in years, didn't argue. 1 year later, on a quiet Tuesday morning, a new face walked into the corner diner for the early shift. A young woman named Priya, 20 years old, in her 2nd year of nursing school, hired to help Sophia handle the growing breakfast crowd. She was nervous her first day. She dropped a plate. She apologized too many times. Eleanor knelt down beside her and helped pick up the pieces. "First week's always the hardest," Eleanor said. "You'll find your footing?" "Everyone says you used to be a surgeon," Priya said, still a little starstruck. "Is that true?" Eleanor smiled, the small, real smile that Sophia had learned to recognize over the years. "I still am one," she said. "I just found a different way to practice." Priya looked down at the broken plate, then back up at her. "Do you ever miss it? The real thing, I mean. The operating room." Eleanor considered the question honestly, the way she considered most things now. "Some days," she said, "but I stopped thinking of this as the fake version. 22 years ago, I thought saving a life only counted if it happened under bright lights with a team of nurses around me. I know better now. Harold Fenwick would tell you table 9 counted plenty." "Will you teach me?" Priya asked. "The CPR class, I mean. I want to learn properly, not just from a video in nursing school." "Tuesday nights," Eleanor said. "Back room after closing. Sophia will save you a seat." Priya smiled, wide and grateful, and went back to refilling the sugar caddies at table 4, moving carefully this time, determined not to drop anything else. Eleanor watched her for a moment. She thought, not for the first time, that Daniel would have been about Priya's age now, had things gone differently. She let the thought sit there, gently, the way she'd learned to let it sit, rather than pushing it away. It still hurt. It probably always would. But it no longer felt like the only true thing about her. She stood, picked up her coffee pot, and walked back out onto the floor, past table 9, where a new group of regulars sat laughing over their breakfast, past the counter where Roy Bellamy nodded at her with something that finally looked like respect. The bell above the door rang, a half-second late, the way it always did. Outside, the town moved through its ordinary Tuesday, a mail carrier making her rounds, a school bus idling at the corner, a world entirely unaware of how many quiet people in it were carrying entire lifetimes nobody had thought to ask about. Somewhere in that town, a retired detective swept a floor he didn't need to sweep. Somewhere else, a line cook flipped eggs with hands that had once carried far heavier things. And at the corner diner, at 6 o'clock every morning, a woman named Eleanor Voss poured coffee into cups that had no idea whose hands were filling them. Not every hero wears scrubs. Some just wear an apron and carry a coffee pot instead of a scalpel, and wait quietly for the one morning when both kinds of hands are needed at exactly the same time.